Welcome to this lecture on web design fundamentals. Today, we're going to walk through some core concepts that form the backbone of building modern web pages, covering image and text layout, margin and padding, section design, and a brief look at how frameworks like Laravel and Tailwind fit into the bigger picture. Let's dive in.
Let's start with one of the most common web design patterns, the hero section. A hero section typically splits the screen into two halves. One side holds an image, and the other side holds your content, a title, a paragraph, and usually a couple of buttons. This split layout is what gives modern landing pages that clean, professional look.
Now, those two buttons at the bottom of the text side aren't always the same HTML element. If a button triggers an action, like submitting a form, you use an actual button tag. But if clicking it navigates the user to another page or link, you use an anchor tag, the A tag. The design might look identical, but the underlying HTML choice matters for both functionality and accessibility. Let's break down the structure more explicitly. The outermost element is a section wrapper that holds everything together. Inside, you have two columns. The left column contains the image, the right column stacks the title at the top, then a descriptive paragraph below it, and finally the two call to action buttons at the bottom. This is the standard hero section structure you'll see on almost every modern website.
This distinction between button and anchor tags trips up a lot of beginners, so it's worth spending a moment on it. Use the button tag when the click triggers something on the page, like calling a JavaScript function or submitting a form. Use the anchor tag when the click takes the user somewhere, a different page, a section on the same page, or an external URL. The visual design of both can look exactly the same, but choosing the right tag is important for semantic correctness.
Now let's talk about the asterisk selector in CSS. When you write an asterisk followed by curly braces in your style sheet, you're targeting every single HTML element on the page. A very common use of this is to reset the default margin that browsers apply to elements. Setting margin to 0 here gives you a clean slate to work from. Padding, on the other hand, doesn't always need to be reset this way. Margin alone is usually enough to get started. Here's an important nuance. While the asterisk is great for resetting margins, it's not the best place to define your font styles. For fonts, you should target the body tag instead. The body tag is the parent of all visible content, so font properties will naturally inherit downward to all child elements. This is cleaner and more semantically appropriate than putting font rules on the universal asterisk selector. There's a key distinction between building the structure of a section and actually designing it. In a previous step, we learned how to create the HTML structure of a section, the skeleton. Now the next step is applying CSS to transform that skeleton into a visually appealing design. This means adding colors, spacing, typography, and layout rules that make the section look the way you want it to on screen.
Looking at some student work here, several students created card designs with image on one side and text on the other, which is exactly the layout pattern we've been discussing. What's interesting is that most of these were built purely from what was taught in class. A few students went further and used AI tools to enhance or extend their designs beyond what was covered. This is a great example of taking foundational knowledge and building on top of it creatively. The highlighted cards here represent designs built entirely from the concepts taught in class. No extra tools, no shortcuts. If you can produce something like this just from what's been covered, that's a solid foundation. The goal isn't to memorize every CSS trick, but to understand the underlying layout principles well enough to construct these patterns from scratch. A common question that comes up is, do you need to learn PHP to work with Laravel? And the honest answer is, it depends on your goals, but it's not strictly required if your focus is on the front end. Laravel is a PHP framework, so PHP knowledge does help, but for someone focused on front-end work, it's not the priority right now. Here's the key insight. The JavaScript we're studying in this course isn't being taught as a complete standalone language course. It's being taught specifically with Laravel integration in mind. That means we focus on the JavaScript concepts that are actually needed when building Laravel-powered applications, not every single feature of the language. This keeps things practical and directly applicable. Another question that comes up is about media queries, those CSS rules that change your layout depending on screen size. In traditional CSS, you write media queries manually to handle responsiveness. But when you're using Tailwind CSS, you largely don't need to write media queries at all. Tailwind has responsiveness built right in through its prefix system. You just add SM, MD, or LG before a class name, and Tailwind handles the rest. To make this concrete, on the left, you see a traditional media query, which requires you to open a block, define a breakpoint, write the property, and close the block. On the right, the Tailwind approach achieves the same result in a single class string. This is why in this course, we're going to lean into Tailwind for handling responsiveness, rather than spending a lot of time on manual media queries. It's faster, cleaner, and industry standard for modern projects.
One more concept worth touching on is CSS variables, also called custom properties. These allow you to define a value once, like a color or a font size, and then reuse it throughout your CSS file using the var function. This makes your CSS much easier to maintain, because if you want to change your brand color, you only change it in one place and it updates everywhere. This is a concept we'll be exploring as we move forward. Continuing from where we left off, let's now get into one of the most powerful tools in CSS, keyframe animations. This is where we can make elements loop, spin, shift colors, and move around, all with just a few lines of CSS. Let's break it all down step by step. So, what exactly is a loop in animation? Think about your daily life. You wake up, eat, work, sleep, and then it repeats. That's a loop. In CSS animations, a loop means one sequence of changes that runs from start to finish, and then repeats. The time it takes to complete one full cycle, say 3 seconds, is your animation duration. Here's a critical rule for smooth loops. Your starting state and ending state must be identical. If the color starts at red at 0%, it must return to red at 100%. If they don't match, you'll see a visible jump or gap between each repetition, which looks broken. To create a keyframe animation, you use the @keyframes rule in CSS. You give it a name. In this example, the name is Jilly-Milly, which means twinkling or glittering. Inside, you define what happens at each percentage of the animation's duration. At 0%, the color is red. At 25%, it shifts to orange. At 50%, it becomes yellow. Then it reverses back. And at 100%, it's red again, matching the start. The name you give to a keyframe block is extremely important. Whatever name you write here, in this case, Jilly-Milly, you must use that exact same name when you apply the animation to an element. A typo or mismatch means the animation simply won't run. By mirroring the color values, orange at both 25% and 75%, and red at both 0% and 100%, the animation transitions smoothly in both directions. This creates that satisfying glittering or flickering effect. It's a simple technique, but visually quite striking. Once you've defined the keyframes, you apply them to an element using the animation property. You need 3 key pieces: the animation name, which must exactly match your @keyframes name, the duration, which here is 3 seconds for one complete loop, and the iteration count. Setting it to infinite means it will run forever without stopping. Let's be precise about these 3 values. The name connects your animation to its definition. The duration controls the speed. A shorter duration means faster animation. And infinite simply means it never stops. If you wanted it to run only 3 times, you'd write the number 3 instead of infinite. Now, let's look at another common animation technique, rotation using the transform property. The transform property does a lot more than just rotate, but let's start here. In this keyframe, an element starts at 0 degrees, reaches 180 degrees at the halfway point, and completes a full 360-degree rotation by the end. And since 360 degrees equals 0 degrees, the loop is perfectly seamless. This is why 360 degrees works perfectly as the end state. It's geometrically identical to 0 degrees. The element has made one complete revolution and is right back where it started. This is what makes the rotation loop seamless and continuous. By default, CSS animations use an easing function that starts slow, speeds up, then slows down again, called ease in out. For a spinning element, this looks unnatural because it appears to stutter and hesitate. Adding the keyword linear to the animation property forces a constant, uniform speed throughout the entire rotation, making it look smooth and mechanical. The transform property also includes translate, which moves elements along the x or y-axis. Moving something up and down means working on the y-axis. Importantly, negative values move the element upward, so translate y of negative 100 pixels moves it 100 pixels up. At 0% and 100%, the element is at its original position, and at 50%, it's at its highest point, creating a smooth floating or bouncing effect. This trips up a lot of beginners. In CSS, the y-axis is inverted compared to what you might expect from math class. Negative y values move things up the screen, and positive y values move things down.
Keep this in mind whenever you're working with Translate Y in your animations. When you animate an element like an image to rotate or move, parts of it can extend beyond its container's boundaries, which often looks messy. Applying overflow hidden to the container solves this. It acts like a mask, clipping anything that goes outside the container's edges. Only the portion inside the box remains visible. So far, we've been writing CSS inside a style tag directly in the HTML file. This is called internal CSS. But as your project grows and you have multiple pages, maintaining styles in each HTML file separately becomes a nightmare. If you need to change one value, you'd have to update every single file. The solution is to create one external CSS file and link it to all your pages. This is the real power of external CSS. You create one file, typically named style.css inside a CSS folder, and every HTML page links to it. Now, if you need to change the container width from 90% to 80%, you change it in one place, and it updates across your entire website instantly. This is standard practice in professional web development. To set this up, create a folder called CSS inside your project directory, then create a file called style.css inside it. Common naming conventions are style.css or index.css. Either works fine. Then in your HTML file, inside the head section, you add a link tag with rel set to style sheet and href pointing to your CSS file's path. From that point on, all styles in that file apply to your page. When you bring in CSS code from external sources, like hover effects, pre-built components, or animation libraries, the right approach is to apply them using classes, not by targeting HTML tags directly. Using classes keeps your code modular and reusable. You can apply the same class to multiple elements, and you won't accidentally break styles across your whole page by changing a tag-level rule. Moving on to deployment, once you've built your website, you need to host it so the world can see it. cPanel is the control panel that most shared hosting providers give you to manage your files, databases, and email. WordPress is a content management system that runs on top of this infrastructure. Many beginners find cPanel confusing at first, but with guidance and practice, it becomes straightforward. One thing to be aware of with WordPress is that your content lives in a database, not just in files. When WordPress updates or when you need to migrate your site, you're dealing with both files and database exports. This is why having support available, someone who can help via screen share or by accessing your cPanel credentials, is genuinely valuable. For those looking to build more complex web-based systems like a daily transaction tracker or a data management system, Laravel with Filament is a highly recommended approach. Laravel is a powerful PHP framework, and Filament is a package that sits on top of it, giving you a beautiful admin interface with forms, tables, and database management almost out of the box. It significantly reduces the time needed to build internal business tools. Picking up from where we left off, let's look at a practical example that ties together what we've been learning. The instructor walks through a real-world scenario. Imagine building an insurance company system. A farmer comes along, registers in the system, and from that point on, his data is stored and managed through transactions in the database. When the farmer registers in the insurance system, a record is created in the database. This is the core idea. Every registration event is a transaction that gets stored. The system handles this automatically, without any manual intervention needed each time. Here's where it gets interesting. When a farmer registers, there's a validation date associated with that registration. The instructor explains that this date is automatically stored as a column in the database. The system handles it on its own. You don't need to manually track or monitor that date. It just sits there in the database, ready to be used. The instructor also touches on an important practical distinction. Who is responsible for designing the user interface? Normally, a UI/UX designer handles the interface design. But if you need really high-quality, visually striking images, what the instructor calls chatara images, that's the job of a graphic designer. The right professional depends on what kind of output you need. Think of it as a decision point. If you're building standard interface elements, buttons, layouts, forms, a UI/UX designer is your go-to. But if the project demands polished, detailed graphic work, you bring in a graphic designer. Understanding this distinction helps you plan your team and your workflow properly. Now we move into a new topic. The instructor is introducing CSS, cascading style sheets. Up until this point, the class has been working on HTML structure. CSS is what takes that structure and turns it into a visually designed page. The instructor mentions that the full CSS curriculum is coming, but today's focus is on understanding how to apply design to the sections already built. Here's the key insight the instructor is driving home.
HTML gives you the skeleton, the structure of a page. CSS is what breathes life into that structure. The instructor specifically mentions working on section design. They've already learned how to build the structure of a section, and now the goal is learning how to transform that structure into a proper visual design.
The instructor lays out a clear learning plan for the class. They're not ending CSS entirely, rather they're wrapping up the foundational CSS concepts and transitioning into something more practical. The next step is learning how to build a complete portfolio page from scratch, which will serve as a hands-on project. After that, the class moves into Tailwind CSS.
The portfolio project is particularly important here. The instructor emphasizes that students will build it themselves, and the focus isn't just on writing CSS, it's on understanding how to approach and start a complete page. That process of going from a blank file to a finished layout is a critical skill, and it's something the instructor plans to demonstrate step by step. The instructor mentions that Tailwind CSS will be covered over roughly 2 days. Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework. Instead of writing custom CSS roles, you apply pre-built utility classes directly in your HTML. It dramatically speeds up the styling process and is widely used in modern web development. This is where the class is headed after the current CSS foundation. A student asks about media queries in CSS. Those are the rules that make a website respond to different screen sizes. The instructor's answer is insightful. In Tailwind CSS, you don't need to write manual media queries. Tailwind has responsiveness built right in. You simply add a breakpoint prefix to your class name, and it handles the responsive behavior automatically. This is one of the biggest advantages of using a framework like Tailwind. This is a really practical takeaway. Writing media queries manually in vanilla CSS requires you to think through every breakpoint, test every screen size, and write quite a bit of extra code. Tailwind abstracts all of that away. The instructor confirms that once students move into Tailwind, responsive design becomes much more straightforward, which is a big relief for beginners. Another student raises a question about CSS variables. How do you use variables in CSS? The instructor acknowledges this is a valid topic and says it will be covered when they work on the portfolio page project. CSS variables, also called custom properties, let you define a value once and reuse it throughout your style sheet. This makes your code much easier to maintain and update. The power of CSS variables is in their reusability. You define a variable, say your brand color, in one place at the root level. Then every time you need that color anywhere in your CSS, you just reference the variable. If you ever need to change the color, you update it in exactly one place, and it automatically updates everywhere it's used. That's clean, efficient code. Picking up right where we left off, the hover effect is working. But the key question isn't just that it works, it's why it works. Understanding the underlying code is what separates someone who copies effects from someone who can build and customize them. So let's make sure that logic is clear before we move on and add more to our layout. The hover pseudo class is what's doing the work here. When the user's cursor moves over the element, the browser automatically applies whatever styles you've defined inside that rule. It's event-driven styling, no JavaScript needed. Once you understand this pattern, you can apply it to buttons, cards, images, navigation links, anything. The instructor points out that this hover effect is something you genuinely want to use in your own portfolio. It's not just a demo, it's production ready. The animation timing, the visual response, it all comes together nicely. The one thing left to do is swap in your own photo and tweak the content to match your personal brand. Now, let's talk about how a full page is structured. A standard web page has 3 major regions: a header at the top, a main content area in the middle, and a footer at the bottom. This is a well-established layout pattern. However, today the focus is narrower. Instead of designing a full page, the instructor wants to zoom in on just one section at a time. Rather than building the entire page from scratch right now, the approach here is to start with a single section tag and design just that one section. This is a smart, focused way to learn layout. You're not overwhelmed by the full page, and you can see the results of your CSS immediately on a contained piece of the UI. Inside every section, the instructor follows a consistent rule. Always create a parent div as a wrapper. This parent container is what you'll use to control layout with Flexbox or Grid. It groups the children together so you can position them as a unit. This is a foundational habit in modern CSS layout. The section being built has a 2-column structure. On the left side, there are multiple elements: a heading, a paragraph, and 2 anchor or button tags. On the right side, there's just a single image. This is a very common layout pattern you'll see on landing pages and portfolio hero sections. Here's an important rule the instructor explains. When you have multiple tags on one side, like a heading, paragraph, and buttons, you absolutely need a parent div to wrap them. But when you have a single element, like just one image, wrapping it in a div is optional. You can place the image tag directly without a container. It's flexible. Use your judgment. This is a rule worth memorizing. If you're placing multiple HTML tags side by side or stacked inside a layout region, you must wrap them in a parent div. Without it, you have nothing to apply Flexbox or Grid to. But if you only have one element, say a single image, you don't need the extra wrapper. It's optional, and adding unnecessary divs just clutters your HTML. Now let's look at what the left column actually contains in the HTML. There's a heading tag for the main title, a paragraph tag for the descriptive text, with the text wrapped in a span tag for styling flexibility, and then 2 anchor tags that will serve as the call to action buttons. The href attributes are left empty for now and can be filled in later. Notice the use of a span tag inside the paragraph. A span is an inline element. It wraps a piece of text so you can apply a specific color, font size, or style to just that portion without affecting the rest of the paragraph. It's a small but powerful tool for fine-grained text styling.
For the right side, the instructor uses a real image sourced directly from a live website. You can right-click any image in the browser and select Copy Image Address. That gives you the direct URL to the image file. That URL goes straight into the src attribute of your IMG tag. This is a quick way to prototype with real visuals before you have your own assets ready. One concern that comes up is whether using a large image will slow down the website. The instructor clarifies that image dimensions are controlled through CSS. You set the width and height in your style sheet, and the browser renders it at that size regardless of the original file dimensions. Optimization techniques like compression are covered later in the course. When you go live with just the HTML structure, no CSS yet, this is what you see. Everything stacks vertically in document flow. The heading, the paragraph, the links, and the image are all just sitting on top of each other. This is completely expected. The structure is correct. Now it's CSS's job to transform this into the 2-column layout we're aiming for. To get those 2 columns side by side, the answer is Flexbox. By applying DisplayFlex to the parent container, the browser automatically arranges the direct children in a row. This is the core of modern CSS layout. The left div with the text content and the right image will snap into columns the moment that one property is added. A question comes up about who is responsible for creating the images used in a website. The instructor explains that it depends on what kind of image you need. UI and UX designers can handle basic visuals and simple design assets. But if you need high-quality, detailed, or complex artwork, illustrations, custom photography, or brand graphics, that's the domain of a dedicated graphic designer. On the administrative side, the instructor mentions that a poll will be created to decide the next class date. There's a planned 3-day gap before classes resume, likely around the 24th or 25th, depending on student availability. The instructor emphasizes that everyone's schedule should be considered, which is why a poll is the right approach, rather than a unilateral decision. The instructor also addresses concerns about accessing recorded class videos. All recordings are stored in the student portal and are protected. They won't be deleted or moved. Students can access them anytime. For any technical issues, support is available directly through the portal, or students can contact the instructor directly. The portal is designed to be a long-term resource throughout the course. Picking up right where we left off, the instructor makes an important point here about where students currently are in their learning journey. Right now, the focus is on understanding how CSS works. The real-world application, using it in production-level projects, comes gradually. You build the foundation first, and the professional workflow follows naturally as you progress. The instructor is clear that students shouldn't expect to jump straight into professional-level usage right away. That level of skill develops step by step. The goal at this stage is to understand the mechanics, how CSS is written, how it's structured, and how it behaves. A student asks how many more days of CSS class are left, and the instructor's answer is really informative. CSS isn't ending entirely, but the next phase begins the very next day, Tailwind CSS. The instructor clarifies that this doesn't mean core CSS is complete. There's still more to cover, specifically how to use CSS in real projects. Tailwind is the next layer on top of what's already been learned. Now we get into a very practical and important concept, external CSS files. Instead of writing all your styles inside a style tag within your HTML file, you create a separate CSS file. This keeps your code clean, organized, and most importantly, reusable.
The same style sheet can be linked to multiple HTML pages, which is how real websites are built. The instructor demonstrates creating a dedicated folder called CSS and placing the style sheet inside it, named style.css. This folder-based organization is a professional habit. It keeps your project tidy and makes it easy to find and manage your styles as the project grows. Here's the actual process the instructor walks through. First, create a folder called CSS. Inside it, create a file called style.css. Then, take all the CSS rules that were previously sitting inside the style tag in your HTML file, cut them out, and paste them directly into that new style.css file. Your HTML file now has no embedded styles. Everything is in the external file. The final and crucial step is linking. In the head section of your HTML file, you write a link tag pointing to the CSS file's path, in this case, css/style.css. Once that link is in place, all the styles from the external file apply to your HTML page, exactly as if they were written in line. The page works just as before. This is where external CSS really shines. If you have multiple HTML pages, say a home page, an about page, and a contact page, you don't need to rewrite your styles for each one. You simply add the same link tag to each HTML file pointing to the same style.css. Every page instantly gets access to all the classes and styles defined in that one file. This is the foundation of scalable web development. The instructor introduces Flowbyte as a component library that students will use later in the course. Once you've learned the fundamentals of CSS, you don't always have to build every UI element from scratch. Libraries like Flowbyte give you pre-built, ready-to-use components, things like navigation bars, modals, cards, and carousels, that you can drop into your project and customize. One specific component the instructor highlights is the carousel, also called a slider. This is the kind of component where images or content panels slide horizontally, usually with navigation arrows. The instructor mentions this as a shortcut example. Instead of building it yourself, you search for carousel in Flowbyte and get the full working code. This is how professional developers work efficiently. The instructor also brings up CodePen, a well-known platform where developers share small front-end experiments, called pens. Each pen contains HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together in one place. The instructor mentions using it heavily in the past, before AI tools became popular. It's a great place to find creative designs and interesting UI effects built by the community. When you open a pen, you see exactly 3 sections: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all editable, with a live preview below. The instructor demonstrates copying a cursor animation design from CodePen. The workflow is: copy the HTML into your own file's boilerplate, paste the CSS into a style tag, and paste the JavaScript into a script tag. This is a practical way to learn from and reuse community-built code. When you take code from CodePen and bring it into your own project, there's a specific structure to follow. The HTML markup goes inside your body tag. The CSS goes inside a style tag. The instructor recommends keeping it internal here rather than external to keep things simple when experimenting. And the JavaScript goes inside a script tag, which is always placed at the very end of the body. This 3-part structure is fundamental to how web pages work. The instructor now shifts focus to the next hands-on project, building a hero section. A hero section is the very first large visual block users see when they land on a website. It typically contains a headline, a short description, and 1 or 2 call to action buttons. It's arguably the most important section of any landing page because it creates the first impression. Looking at the structure underneath the design, it's straightforward. The headline is an H1 or H2 tag. The supporting text is a paragraph tag. The call to action buttons can be either actual button tags or anchor tags styled to look like buttons. The instructor notes that while the visual design may differ between projects, the underlying HTML structure is almost always the same. The instructor outlines 2 upcoming topics. First, building out the hero section, applying the CSS and layout skills learned so far to create a real styled web page component. Second, an introduction to Figma, a design tool widely used by both designers and developers. These 2 topics together bridge the gap between writing code and understanding how professional web designs are created and handed off to developers. Continuing from where we left off, the instructor touches on how to get started building a portfolio page from scratch, specifically how to begin structuring a computer page for a portfolio project. This guidance is aimed at students who are just beginning to think about how their own portfolio should be laid out and organized. The instructor makes clear that when you sit down to build a portfolio page, the very first thing you need to think about is structure. Just like any well-designed web page, a portfolio starts with a header, a main content area, and a footer.
That foundation makes everything else easier to build on top of.
There's also a brief but important administrative moment in the session. The instructor discusses upcoming class days and breaks. The plan is to have one more class day, then give students a short holiday break, after which classes resume from Sunday. The instructor even mentions creating a WhatsApp poll to get students' input on the schedule. This kind of student-centered scheduling is worth noting. The instructor is actively involving students in deciding when to reconvene after the break. A WhatsApp poll is proposed, so the majority can weigh in. The takeaway here is that communication and flexibility are part of how this learning environment operates. Now, let's get into the technical content. The instructor explains how JavaScript can be integrated into an HTML page using the script tag, very much the same way CSS is embedded using the style tag. Just as CSS lives inside a style tag, JavaScript lives inside a script tag. This is the inline or internal method of including JS. The parallel is really elegant and worth emphasizing. CSS has its style tag, JavaScript has its script tag. Both can be written directly inside the HTML file without needing any external files. This internal approach is great for learning and quick testing, even if external files are the best practice for larger projects. When the instructor tries to use a JavaScript import statement directly in a script tag, the browser throws an error, cannot use import statement outside of a module. This is a very common error that trips up beginners. The browser is telling you that import syntax is only allowed inside JavaScript modules, not in regular script tags. The fix is straightforward once you understand what's happening. You need to tell the browser that your script is a module by adding the attribute type equals module to your script tag. Without this, the browser treats the file as a classic script, which does not support the import and export syntax that modern JavaScript modules rely on. To resolve the module error, the instructor creates a dedicated folder called JS, and inside it places a file named cursor.js. The JavaScript code is then cut from the HTML file and pasted into this external file. The script tag in the HTML is updated to reference this file, and critically, the type equals module attribute is added. This is a best practice workflow. Keep your JavaScript in its own file, organized in its own folder, and link it properly from HTML. The type equals module attribute unlocks the full power of modern JavaScript, including import and export statements, and keeps your code modular and maintainable as your project grows. Once the module issue is resolved, the instructor notices something else. There are now 2 headers appearing on the page, and some components are not behaving as expected. The decision is made to strip out the framework components entirely and build the design from scratch using custom CSS, starting with just the canvas and the hero section. This is actually a really important lesson in web development. Sometimes using a framework introduces more complexity than it solves, especially when you're learning. By removing pre-built components and designing everything yourself, you gain full control over the layout, the styles, and the behavior, and you understand exactly why each element looks the way it does. The instructor copies the previously built hero section from an earlier project and pastes it into the current page. At first, it disappears, it becomes invisible, because the hero CSS class is missing. Once the correct class name is applied, the background and layout snap back into place. This reinforces how tightly HTML structure and CSS class names are connected. The moment the correct class name is added back, the hero section reappears with its background styling intact. This is a great reminder that in CSS, class names are the bridge between your HTML structure and your visual design. If the class is missing or misspelled, the styles simply don't apply. The element exists but looks invisible or unstyled. The instructor also addresses font management. The question comes up about where to define fonts. Should you use the asterisk selector to apply fonts to every single element? The answer is no. Applying fonts to the body tag is sufficient because child elements inherit the font family from their parent by default through CSS inheritance. CSS inheritance is a powerful feature that beginners often overlook. When you set font family on the body element, every element inside the body, headings, paragraphs, spans, divs, automatically inherits that font unless you explicitly override it. This means you only need to define your base font once, keeping your CSS clean and efficient. The instructor mentions that Google Fonts will also be demonstrated in this session. Google Fonts is a free library of web fonts that you can import into any web page with just 2 steps. Add a limby tag to your HTML head pointing to the Google Fonts CDN, and then reference the font name in your CSS font family property. The 2-step process is simple but easy to forget one half of. Step 1, copy the link tag from Google Fonts and paste it inside your HTML head.
Step 2, use the exact font name they provide in your CSS font family declaration. If either step is missing, the browser will fall back to a default system font instead of the one you chose. Finally, the instructor shifts the focus toward a section-based approach to page design. Rather than thinking about the entire page at once, the idea is to design and style one section at a time. Today's focus is on the section layout using Tailwind CSS, looking at how utility classes can be applied cleanly to individual sections like the hero, features, and footer. Tailwind CSS makes section-based design very intuitive because each utility class maps directly to a single CSS property. Instead of writing a separate style sheet, you compose your design right in the HTML using these small descriptive class names. This approach keeps your focus on one section at a time, which is exactly the workflow the instructor is guiding students through. Continuing from where we left off, let's talk about a practical use case that came up, building a daily transaction system for storing database records. The recommendation here is to go web-based, using Laravel with Filament. This stack handles all the mathematical calculations you'd need, since it's a full programming language environment. Once hosted, transactions can be recorded and stored online from anywhere. A concrete example given was an insurance company system. A farmer comes in, registers on the system, and from that point forward, all their transaction data is stored and accessible online. This is exactly the kind of real-world application this stack is designed to handle, straightforward to build and easy to host. Moving into the hero section design, the approach here is to copy an existing hero section and paste it into the new layout. One common issue that comes up is the background disappearing. This happens when the hero class isn't applied correctly. Once the class is properly attached, the background comes back. This is a normal part of iterative front-end development. Things break, you identify why, and you fix them. Now let's get into Flexbox. The goal is to place two elements, an image section and a content section, side by side. Flexbox is the tool for this. The key rule, you apply display flex to the parent element, not the children. The parent sees its children and arranges them in a row by default. So we identify the parent container that holds both the image div and the content div, and that's where Flex goes. In practice, a class called HeroDiv is created and given displayFlex. This immediately brings the two sections side by side. A gap property is also added to create spacing between them. At first, the layout may look off, the image might overflow, but that's expected. You fix issues one at a time, progressively refining the layout. When both children are inside a Flex container, each child defaults to taking up space based on its content. To split them evenly, we assign width 50% to both child 1 and child 2. Since percentage widths are relative to the parent, each child takes exactly half. The image inside child 2 also needs width 100%, so it fills its own container. Otherwise, it overflows beyond the boundary. Notice the comma syntax here. .child1, .child2 applies the same CSS to both classes at once. This is a powerful shorthand. Whenever multiple elements share the same styling, you separate their selectors with a comma instead of writing duplicate rules. The image inside child 2 gets width 100%, so it scales to match its parent's half-width boundary. After getting the side-by-side layout, the next issue is vertical alignment. The text content sits at the top while the image is taller. To center the content vertically, align item's center is applied to the flex parent, the hero div. This works because align items controls alignment along the cross-axis, which in a row direction flex container means vertical centering. It's important to understand the axis distinction in Flexbox. The main axis runs in the direction of flex, horizontally by default. The cross-axis is perpendicular, vertical. Justify content controls alignment along the main axis, while align items controls alignment along the cross-axis. So for vertical centering in a row layout, align items is always the property to reach for. Here's an important concept, the difference between a section and a container. The section spans the full width of the page, 100%, but we don't want our content stretching wall to wall. So inside the section, we create a container div that has a fixed percentage width, say 86%, and center it using margin auto. This creates the visual side gaps you see on professional websites. Think of it this way. The section is responsible for background colors and full width effects like shadows or gradients. The container inside it is responsible for keeping the actual text and content within a readable, centered column. The orange areas on the sides are the automatic margins that push the container to the center. This pattern repeats on every section of the page.
Instead of adding margin and width to every individual section, the smart approach is to create one reusable container class. Any section that needs that centered, gap-creating layout just uses this class. This is a core principle of scalable CSS. Define once, reuse everywhere. The name container isn't a reserved keyword. It's just a conventional name the community uses. One element can have multiple classes at once, separated by spaces. So the hero section's inner div gets both container and hero div. Container handles the width and centering. Hero div handles the flex layout. This composable approach keeps your CSS organized and avoids repeating yourself. Each class has one clear responsibility. A student asked a great question. Why not apply the container class directly to the main tag? Here's why. If you want a background color or a shadow to span the full width of the page, it must be on the section, not the container. If you put the background on the container, it only covers 86% of the screen. The section always gets full width styling. The container inside it gets the content constraints. To add vertical breathing room above and below the hero content, padding is added to the hero div. But here's a subtle point. We only add padding on the y-axis, top and bottom. The x-axis already has spacing handled by the container's margin auto. Writing padding 50 pixels 0 means 50 pixels top and bottom, 0 left and right. This shorthand is cleaner than writing padding top and padding bottom separately. Here's a useful CSS trick, the asterisk wildcard selector. Writing .child1 * targets every single element inside child1, regardless of tag type. So instead of giving a margin class to each h1, p, and anchor tag individually, one rule handles them all. This is efficient, but use it carefully. If you later add a font size rule with asterisk, it will apply to every nested element, which may not always be what you want. The caution here is real. If you use the wildcard to set font size, every element inside, including small labels or anchor tags, gets that size. The instructor demonstrates this by setting font size on child 1's asterisk and noting it affects everything. For margins and spacing, wildcard is great. For typography, it's usually better to target specific tags like H1 or P directly. For the hero section buttons, two different styles are created. Button 1 is a solid filled button with an orange-red background color and white text. Button 2 is an outlined or ghost button, transparent background with a visible border. The border shorthand takes three values: width, style, and color. For example, border 2 pixels solid white creates a 2 pixel solid white border. Both buttons share common properties: white text, no text decoration since they're anchor tags, and padding for size. The key difference is how the background is handled. Button 1 uses a solid fill. Button 2 removes the background and relies on the border to define its shape. This two-button pattern, one solid, one outlined, is extremely common in modern hero section designs. When you need an exact color from a design, like matching a logo's specific shade, the Eyedropper Chrome extension is the tool to use. Search for Eyedropper in the Chrome Web Store, add it, and pin it to your toolbar. Click the extension, hover over any color on screen, click to pick it, and the hex code is automatically copied. Then paste it directly into your CSS. No more guessing color values. Anchor tags are inline elements by default. They only take up as much space as their content. But inside a Flex container, we want buttons to have controlled widths. Setting display block on an anchor makes it behave like a block element, filling its parent's full width. Then text align center centers the text inside it. Alternatively, with 50, the two buttons are wrapped in a parent div with class buttons. This parent gets display flex to place them side by side, plus a gap for spacing between them. To center them horizontally on the page, justify content center is used. This works along the main axis of the Flex container. Remember, justify content is for the main axis direction. Align items is for the cross axis. Getting these two straight is fundamental to mastering Flexbox. Here's a productivity shortcut worth remembering. Control-D in VS Code. Click on any word, then press Control-D repeatedly. Each press selects the next occurrence of that same word in the file. Once all instances are selected, you can type and edit all of them simultaneously. This is incredibly useful when renaming a class or changing a repeated value across multiple rules. No find and replace needed. The instructor demonstrates this by clicking on a semicolon, pressing Control-D multiple times until all semicolons in the block are selected, then editing them all at once. This short count is listed in the shared notes document. The recommendation is to go through all the shortcuts listed there and try each one. Understanding what they do makes you dramatically faster as a developer. To make button 2 interactive, a hover state is added using the :hover pseudoclass. On hover, the background color changes to the brand color and the text color switches to white, the inverse of the default state. The transition property is added to make this change animate smoothly rather than snap instantly. A value of around 0.3 seconds gives a clean, professional feel without being too slow. The transition property is placed on the base button style, not on the hover state. This ensures the animation plays both when entering and leaving the hover state. If you put transition only on the hover, the animation only plays on mouse enter but snaps back instantly on mouse leave. Always put transition on the base element for a smooth two-way effect. The last concept introduced here is CSS keyframes. The word keyframe can be understood similarly to a loop. It defines an animation that repeats. A keyframe defines two states, a starting state using from and an ending state using to. The browser smoothly interpolates between them. Combined with animation-iteration-count-infinite, the animation loops continuously, which is useful for things like floating effects or pulsing indicators in a hero section. Let's talk about responsive design, one of the most important concepts in modern web development. The instructor sets up a fresh HTML boilerplate file, naming it Day-5.html, and encourages students to do the same. The idea is simple. Whenever you create a new file, you start with this standard boilerplate structure. It forms the foundation that everything else builds on. One of the first things the instructor adds to the style sheet is a universal selector, the asterisk, with margin set to 0. This resets the default margin that browsers apply to elements, giving you a clean, predictable starting point for your layout. The instructor clarifies that you only need to reset margin here. Padding reset is not strictly necessary unless your design calls for it. A student asks whether both margin and padding should be reset to 0. The instructor's answer is clear. Resetting margin is enough. Browsers add default margins to elements like headings and paragraphs, which can throw off your layout. Padding, on the other hand, is typically something you add intentionally as part of your design, so there's no need to wipe it out by default. The instructor shifts focus to a very practical goal, building a portfolio page. This is something every student needs to create on their own. The instructor explains that they will teach the approach, how to start a complete page from scratch, covering the thought process and structure, not just the code. A portfolio is one of the most valuable things a web development student can build early on. Looking ahead, the instructor outlines the plan. After covering responsive design foundations today, the next 2 days will be dedicated to Tailwind CSS. Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework that speeds up styling significantly. The instructor keeps the current session focused and concise, knowing that students need time to practice rather than being overloaded with new information all at once. A student raises the question, which database server should we use? The instructor's answer is XAMPP, a popular local development environment that bundles Apache, MySQL, and PHP together. It's one of the most widely used tools for beginners learning server-side web development because it runs entirely on your local machine without needing an internet connection. XAMPP stands for Cross-Platform Apache, MariaDB, PHP, and Perl. It gives you everything you need to run a server locally. The instructor confirms this is the tool of choice for the course, making it the go-to answer when students wonder how to set up a backend environment on their own machines. Another student asks whether they need to learn PHP specifically for Laravel. The instructor's answer is refreshingly honest. It's your choice. The instructor personally doesn't teach PHP as a prerequisite for Laravel in this course. However, understanding PHP fundamentals does help when working with Laravel, since Laravel is a PHP framework. WordPress also uses PHP, but working with WordPress doesn't necessarily require deep PHP knowledge. The instructor offers to share the project file directly with students. The idea is that students can take this base file, remove the instructor's code, and replace it with their own. This is a practical learning approach. Rather than starting from a completely blank slate, students get a working structure and focus their energy on writing the actual content and styles themselves. The instructor wraps up with an important mindset note. Students shouldn't expect to jump directly into real-world professional work right now. That level of proficiency comes gradually, through consistent practice, building projects, and iterating over time. The instructor reassures students that this progression is completely normal and expected. Everyone gets there step by step, not all at once. To wrap up everything covered in this session, always start your HTML files with a proper boilerplate. Use the universal selector to reset margins and keep your layouts predictable. When working with databases locally, XAMPP is your best friend. And most importantly, start building your portfolio now. Real-world readiness isn't a destination you reach overnight. It's built through consistent, hands-on practice every single day.